Let's get rolling. We'll get some introductions happening here, and I'll go through a little housekeeping, and hopefully the next couple people will roll in while we're doing that, and then we'll get started. My name's Lindsay. Welcome to A Project Manager's Guide to DevOps. Happy Project Management Week, everyone. And let me introduce your lovely speaker for today. Her name is ERIKA FLORA. She is my boss and the principal at Beyond 20. She has done a lot of work with DevOps. It's a pretty new thing as of the past 5 years or so. We've learned a lot in the past couple ourselves, and we're excited to share it with you guys today. ERIKA is a PMP. She's also a program management professional. She's got a lot of accreditations with ITIL. She's an ITIL expert, of course, and she's also a certified Scrum practitioner. And I think you'll find as we go through this presentation today that a lot of what you're seeing with DevOps has evolved from the Scrum and Agile methodologies. So there's a lot to talk about with that respect as well. So without further ado, ERIKA, I'll pass it over to you, and we can get rolling with the DevOps.
Great. Well, welcome, everyone. In front of you, we have the agenda, so let's talk through that a little bit, what we're going to be talking about today. And like Lindsay said, we'll definitely leave some time for questions. So if you have easy questions, I will answer them. If you've got hard ones, I'm going to give those to you, Lindsay. Does that sound like a deal?
We can discuss that later this afternoon.
Okay, fantastic. So in our agenda, I think it's really important to talk about the history of DevOps. It's this term that if you haven't heard of it, you will start to hear it more and more. I just came from a conference around IT service management, and there was a whole day and a half that they spent just talking about DevOps because it's something that organizations are starting to become much more interested in. Just within the last few years, I've seen it just really start to explode in the industry. So we'll talk about where it came from, and then we'll talk about why should you care? Why should your organization care? What are the benefits of practicing this thing called DevOps? I think it's also important to talk about what it is. It's a pretty new topic, so when you Google DevOps, you come up with 1,000 different things that it means. So we'll share what we think it means, some compelling definitions of it. And then once we talk about what DevOps is at a high level, we'll give you a bunch of tips. So as a project manager, you can start thinking about discussing and learning more. And then we'll actually round out the session with some resources, some blogs, some books, all different kinds of places that you can go to learn more and really become the expert, or at least be able to hold your own when the question or when the topic comes up as you start to hear people talk about it more and more in your organization. So this is me. For those of you that have never met me before, my name is ERIKA FLORA. Like Lindsay said, I am one of the principals of Beyond 20, and I have a lot of letters behind my name, but really what I'm passionate about is finding ways to work better within an organization. I have been a long-time project and program manager, and I've been fortunate enough to work on some really interesting projects at the enterprise level that have helped organizations transform. And I wholeheartedly believe in good project management. But then I also see so much value in some of the other things, the other best practices that have come out over the last few decades, like ITIL, like Agile, and the Scrum method. And I think when you start putting some of these together, they all feed into this idea of DevOps, which we will talk about. So a little bit about Beyond 20. If this is your first webinar you're attending with us, the name Beyond 20 actually comes from a Gartner research study. When Gartner looked at root cause of when mission critical systems in an organization failed, they found that actually only 20% of the time it's due to things like hardware and software, that actually 80% of the time when things fail that really bring an organization to a halt, they were able to trace back 80% of the time it was due to failure in people and failure in process. And so that's what we're passionate about. We fix the people and the process stuff. And DevOps really is one of those things that I think is process, but it's also a lot of people. There's a huge people component to it. And if you can get that right, you can really help move the organization forward. One other thing that I do want to point out is that we are a registered global or a global registered educational provider with PMI. So by attending today, you get one PDU. We also, if you guys check out our YouTube site, we have, I think, pretty close to 200 videos now on YouTube, and we've got them broken down into different areas. So we've got a whole section on just videos around Scrum and Agile, and we have a whole section on just ITIL and IT service management. So if these acronyms that I'm talking about don't make any sort of sense to you, or Prince2 or anything else like that, feel free to check out our videos. The ones that are about 45 minutes to an hour long, you actually do get a PDU for watching those, so I encourage you guys to check those out. Those are completely free. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about history and where this crazy word of DevOps came together. It actually started with a guy by the name of Patrick Dubois. He first introduced the idea at an Agile conference in Toronto back in 2008. He's since that time become a major thought leader in the field, and he's a consultant that helps organizations figure out how can we start adopting this philosophy of DevOps. And then in 2009, there were a couple guys, John Alspaugh and Paul Hammond. One is the head of the development team, one is the head of the engineering or the operations team. And there's another thought leader we'll talk about, Gene Kim, said this was really the seminal DevOps presentation. The two of them worked at Flickr at the time, and they introduced this idea of how they're doing it on a large scale, bringing development and operations and having them work together. They have a really great YouTube video, if you search their names, where they talk through how they were able to do 10 deployments every day at Flickr. So they were able to introduce a tremendous amount of change, but not take their site down and have it be successful in bringing the two sides together. So that was in 2009. And then in 2011, there was a guy by the name of Cameron Hite, and I'm probably butchering all of these folks' names, but he really brought it to the mainstream. He was working for Gartner Research at the time, and in 2011, he put in a slide that talked about this philosophy of DevOps. And if you look at the little call-out button next to his name, he said, by 2015, DevOps will evolve from a niche strategy employed by large cloud providers into a mainstream strategy employed by 20% of Global 2000 organizations. Now, I don't know if it really has gone in that direction by 2015, but it is something that I'm really hearing a lot more organizations talk about. In 2013, Gene Kim, he was is still a prolific thought leader and writer in the space of IT service management. He wrote this book called The Phoenix Project, hugely popular book, really helped shape and bring the conversation even further. The Phoenix Project is a really interesting book in the sense that he wrote it in this like story format, so it's really easy to read, and it's really interesting around this fictitious company and how they changed, and there's all different characters in it, so it's a really engaging read. So that was 2013, and then in 2014, very huge organizations that have name recognition like Target, like Lego, like Nordstrom started adopting DevOps and really started making it a household term. So why DevOps? What's the compelling reason behind it? This is what's driving a lot of organizations to move towards this philosophy of DevOps. Number one, you get higher quality of products and services. You're able to shorten your cycle times and get products and services to market more quickly and be more competitive. You're able to have quicker feedback loops and get customer feedback more often and make sure that what you're delivering actually lines up with current requirements, current needs. Lower cost is on here, but I would say that why organizations are moving towards DevOps isn't necessarily to have lower costs, and that shouldn't be the compelling reason to do it, because we'll talk later in some of the tips as to some things that you can start doing with DevOps, but the talent that you hire to help you implement DevOps into your organization may be, frankly, more expensive than your current resources, and you may not necessarily save any costs, at least not initially, but what you are able to do is do more with the money that you are spending, which is very, very compelling. There's lower levels of burnout because the two sides are working towards a greater good, so you get happier people, higher overall organizational performance, and it really starts to bring this culture of learning and continuous improvement. So you're teaching your development side operations, and you're teaching operations development. You're bringing those two sides together, and everyone's actually working towards a common goal. Okay, so what is DevOps? It is a philosophy. It's not a framework or a methodology or anything like that yet. It is still pretty new. And it's one of those things that I think here in a few years we'll start moving in that direction, but it's not there yet. It's still this philosophy, and we'll talk about exactly what that philosophy is. But it's similar in the progression that project management has made, that Agile has made. When you think about project management, it was back in like the late 60s that there was a white paper on project management. It was a very simple document that gave birth to the first iteration of the project management body of knowledge guide, and since then has become a much larger book, and that really is the standard and the framework for how we do project management. But it didn't start out that way. It had its genesis a few decades ago. And from that PMBOK guide, organizations have to figure out how exactly are we going to implement this? What is our methodology for managing projects? So that's project management. Agile is much, much newer. In 2001, a bunch of software developers got together and they said, the traditional way of working doesn't work for us, and we've been very successful, and let's get together and talk about why we've been successful. And they came up with this thing called Agile Manifesto that said, here's what the philosophy of Agile looks like. And since that time, there's been like 15 or 16 different methods that you can use to implement this philosophy of Agile, of having a lightweight approach to projects. And DevOps is even newer. We talked about the very first person that talked about it was in 2008, still pretty recent. And so a lot of organizations are coming up with what that means for them. So it is a little bit do-it-yourself right now, but that will be changing. Okay, so this is just one of an infinite number of DevOps definitions, but I think it's a really compelling definition. Previously or traditionally, the philosophy is that there's development and then there's operations, and the two sides are very, very different. The two sides work against one another, and so the traditional philosophy has been development versus operations. What DevOps says is development needs to work with operations. So it took, very cleverly, they took the first few letters of development, and that's the dev side, and the first few letters of operation, and that's the last piece of it. So DevOps really is just the combination of the two. So what the philosophy actually strives to do, and it says here, is true integration of development and operations teams to improve collaboration, to improve productivity by automating infrastructure and workflows and continuously measuring application performance. Of the things that I've seen, I think that does a really good job of defining what that philosophy is.
Another thing, ERIKA, to kind of jump in here that I think is interesting about combining dev and ops is kind of what I mentioned in the introduction, referencing the Agile philosophy and when that first came to pass. I know that's kind of evolving a little bit too, and now it's incorporating a bit more of the operations side than it did initially. But one of the things that caused people to start thinking in this new way that is DevOps was that Agile was really focused on speeding up the development side of things, making sure that was running like a well-oiled machine, and incorporating feedback, a lot of the similar things you're going to be hearing throughout the rest of this presentation, but it didn't mess with the operations side much at all. So what you had was this really quick, seamless development process, and then it got kicked over to operations, and they were still moving at a snail's pace. So combining those two things and using the same philosophies on both sides of the wall, or breaking down the wall, I think would maybe be a better analogy, is a pretty interesting, I think, evolution of the Agile thinking.
Excellent. So this philosophy really, to what Lindsay was saying, really breaks down the silos between the two sides. And this is an issue that has been in just about every organization I've worked in, that I've seen, that we've consulted with, that invariably, I'm sure each of you have dealt with this as well, that development will create something, and then once that has been created, they will lob it over the fence or lob the grenade over the wall and dump it on the laps of the ops folks. And it's frustrating for both sides, and both sides don't really understand or work together. But by combining and involving both sides, you start to deal with this issue that has been an issue for so long. DevOps helps reduce the friction between the two teams, helps build a culture of trust, gives them ways to better work together, and helps them work in identical working environments. So, your development or your test environment is going to be the same as production, or be a lot closer to. So you end up with less problems, less rework, less issues later on. So there's this philosophy or this concept within DevOps called shifting left, which is saying let's not have development as its own world, essentially, and then once that service, that product, whatever it be, get thrown over the wall, let's bring operations into development. This is showing a couple of different things. Number one, development needs to think about operational requirements, not just think about operational requirements, but really have operations folks on the team, have operations actually involved in design, in development, instead of incorporating them after the fact. All parties need to be involved early on in development. The other thing that this is showing here is that you want to take your changes and break them up into small things so that you can do all of these things here on the screen very quickly, so that you can do unit testing and then bring all those components together, do functional testing, do customer or user acceptance testing, and then do continuous monitoring and bring all of those things together, shift all of the operational stuff, so the stuff that's on the right shifted over to the left.
Another thing, ERIKA, I know we were discussing as we were doing research for this project was the idea of giving better access to either team's information. So you're inviting ops into the conversation earlier on and earlier and earlier and earlier as you get better and better at it. So you might still be, lodging some complaints with what dev is doing or vice versa, but hopefully the bombs are a little bit smaller. In addition to that, though, something that works really well is don't guard your information like it's Fort Knox. If there's something on the operational side that dev is going to run into over and over again, don't make them seek someone out on the operational side to ask those questions, hunt them down and turn what could be a 5-minute problem into, a 5-week problem trying to resolve something because they don't have access to the information. And that kind of goes back to the identical working environments thing. Make sure you're testing, of course, in what the production environment will look like, but also just make sure your dev people know what's going on the ops side, know what their parameters and restrictions are, and just let them see it without having to track somebody down.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And one example that comes to mind is we have a large company that is a service provider, and they really struggled with the fact that dev was completely separate from operations. And so they are literally taking down cube walls, putting folks from dev teams with operations teams so they can actually look eyeball to eyeball. They're sharing contact information with one another. They're finding ways to bring those two sides physically into more collaborative structures. Okay, so 4 of the common principles that you'll hear as you start looking at the information that's out there on DevOps is they say that these are 4 principles that really bring a lot of success. That number 1, when you develop, when you test, it should be against production-like principles. That dev and test environments should be like production. You don't want to make those very different. You also want to make sure that when you deploy, whether it be new versions of applications, it could be products, it could be services, that when you deploy, you've got repeatable, reliable, automated, where you can automate it, processes. It doesn't say do away with your processes, and in fact you have to have really, really good rigor. If you don't have a very solid, let's say, change management process, and if you don't document your changes, then you're going to try to make, like Flickr was saying, they have 10 deployments a day. If you are bringing down a critical system 10 times a day and doing that, you're not going to be able to do this. So you've got to address the process side of it, make sure that your processes are solid so that you can do this in a more repeatable fashion. The third thing is you want to make sure that you can monitor and validate operational quality. One thing that I've seen to be really successful is if folks on the dev team have skin in the game, once things go to operations, they develop differently. When they know that, hey, I'm going to have to come in and do bug fixes and things like that, rather than letting somebody else worry about it on a totally different team, they tend to deploy things with less bugs, to be honest. So you want to make sure that there's a way that you can monitor, validate the quality of products or services that are being released and deployed. And then the last thing is you want to find ways to amplify your feedback loops. So how do you get more feedback for the products and services that are being deployed? How do you have more customer touch points? Those kinds of things all need to be discussed and figured out as an organization. What you'll notice too is a lot of this stuff really pulls, if you guys are familiar with Agile and Scrum, it pulls a lot of concepts from that. It also does pull a lot of concepts from IT service management and just says, let's take the best of both sides and let's figure out, in a practical way how we can merge the two. Okay, so tip number 1. This happens so much with things that have become buzzwords in the industry is people say, oh, we have to do DevOps. Well, why? Don't just do something because it's the latest and greatest and it sounds like it's going to be the silver bullet. Figure out what's going wrong in your organization. Where are you having the most pain or find the right itch and then try to scratch it. See if there's concepts within this DevOps philosophy that will help you address the big pain points that you're having. But think of it as just a tool. It's a tool to get you to where you're trying to go, but you have to understand the why. You have to understand the where you're trying to go first. And also I would say is there's so many different definitions of what DevOps is. Figure out what it means for your organization because that's going to be something that has to be tailored. It has to make sense for your organization, not just a me too. All of these other big name companies are doing it. Figure out the reason behind it for your place. Okay, so tip number 2, you want to make sure that you understand how to introduce this within your organization, and that with any sort of change, you have to allow people the time to devote to it. There could be additional testing or different kinds of testing that need to be involved to bring more of a philosophy of DevOps into your organization. So you've got to give people time to do it. There's going to be an opportunity cost and other things that don't get done because you want to make sure that bringing this into the organization is going to be successful.
Another thing about this, I think defining your project is a really interesting part because, if you have parameters, if you don't have parameters in your organization that defines what a project is for you, then you should get them run, don't walk, to go get those defined within your organization. But there are going to be things that are still going to be proper, projects at your organization and aren't necessarily going to fall within the umbrella of DevOps. I kind of see it as more of like a high level thing. This is how this organization works, but you also have to, keep your projects identified and run those as such. And also with the smooth introduction thing, something I ran across in doing some research a while back on this was, this is not a philosophy that is introduced very well from the top down. So if your organization is a pretty like hierarchical one, it's not something that you can just kind of lord over people and the CEO says, this is what we're doing now, sorry folks, because it's so heavily entrenched in relationships. It's very kumbaya in that way. If you don't have a dev team and an ops team, that understand each other and can communicate well and see each other's, needs, then no matter, how many C-level people in your organization tell you this is what you're doing, it's not going to go well. So it takes quite a bit of kind of rounding up the troops and team building and stuff like that in order for it to be truly successful when you kick it off.
Yeah, I think with anything, the concepts seem easy. The deployment of it a lot of times can be hard because there's a huge human component of it. And if you don't address or fix the culture issues that are going on, this is going to fall flat, just like anything else. Tip number 3, think about resource capacity and deadlines. Make sure that, like we said before, that you give people the tools, the time that they need in order for this to be successful. I don't know, Lindsay, if you wanted to add a little bit to that as well.
Yeah, I think if you're looking at these two, pie charts, what we're trying to get across here essentially is you can't keep your operations with the same capacity, at least in the initial kickoff when you're kind of introducing DevOps into your organization. If projects are 80%, operations are 20%, you can't introduce DevOps and leave operations at 20% because it's going to be taking a lot of their resources, and hopefully less and less over time, as the teams start working better together. But you've got to anticipate, especially, and we'll talk about this later, I think it's in tip 4, but the people that you're going to have on these DevOps projects are probably going to be, again, at least initially, your strongest people in operations. So if you're taking your strongest people out of the game to work on something else for a while, you need to adjust, capacity and workflow and all of that so you don't miss your deadlines, which I know as a project manager is a really big deal. So if you're not, carving out another piece of the pie for DevOps, then you're setting yourself up, at least in your operations, for failure a little bit. So it's something to keep in mind, that you're not overworking and then flirting with that burnout issue again. Just make room to have a smooth introduction without making everyone crazy.
And then, yeah, tip number 4 is make sure that you've got the right people involved in any DevOps initiative. So you really want people to have an understanding of both sides. So, developers think very often very differently than folks that have worked in operations, and it's a rare person that has skills in both. But you want to think about, okay, who do we have in infrastructure that also understands development and kind of gets that, and who do we have in development that can, that understands operations? So for example, do we have a sysadmin that also can program? Because that's going to be really helpful as you start down the path of DevOps. One of the things that you want to do is be able to automate releases, and that takes some programming skills. And those people, I think Lindsay had touched on this, those people are going to be people that you probably depend on for a lot of other things. They're going to be highly skilled, a lot of times more highly paid, but it's really important as you go down this path that you get the right people in the room that really conceptually and philosophically get both sides of the equation.
Yeah, and that harkens back, ERIKA, to what you were mentioning at the very beginning of the presentation. When it's telling you you're going to have lower costs as you adopt DevOps into your organization. I don't know how true that is. I agree with you. I think you might be spending a little bit more money to get really good gold star people like this, because they're hard to find. So that's something I think to keep in mind as well, to make it a really rigorous search. Someone who can keep an open mind, and demonize seems too strong a word, but someone who can see, okay, I work in dev, but it's not horribly outrageous that ops is asking me for this thing or asking me to fix this or that or whatever. It can be a rare quantity.
Yeah, absolutely. And the perception of each side is really funny. When you ask operations people, and I have a number of customers like this, they kind of see dev as the enemy, and dev sees ops as the enemy. Operations has this perception, whether it be true or not, is that the folks in dev just put crappy code out there, and then the folks in development say, the ops people, they freak out when stuff breaks, and so the one side really blames the other. And so this is all about how do you bring those two sides together so that they don't see an us versus them, it's a we. Okay, so some resources that we really like. Puppet Labs is one of the tools. There's a lot of tools out there that can help with DevOps. Puppet Labs product, as well as there's another one that's called Chef that's really popular, that helps with this automation or automated infrastructure. Puppet Labs puts out a report every year on the state of DevOps. So that's a pretty good read. Gene Kim's book, The Phoenix Project, is also a really good read. And then there's a couple of blogs out there that are really good. Adrian Cockcroft and John Alspaugh. John Alspaugh is the one that worked for Flickr. They've got some really good stuff out there. So I would recommend, if you guys are looking to learn more, to check those out. And in fact, I would implore you guys, project managers, as project managers, we are project leaders. And it's important to, as these new buzzwords and things like that come out, to really dig in and try to learn a bit about them, so you're not surprised when folks start talking about it, and you're not involved in the conversation. So, and it's also part of just improving yourself, and you get PDUs for reading books, for writing. So I encourage you to really lean into it and figure out what DevOps means for you and means for your organization, and if it's something that you guys want to or need to explore.
It's a fun time to do it too. I think you'll find if you do take some time to read a few of these blogs. First of all, it is a rabbit hole. It'll turn into your afternoon. But what you're seeing right now is some of the brightest minds, in the industry really going through and trying to hash this out and see what's most impactful in organizations, what makes the most sense, and you're getting iterations on a philosophy from some of the smartest folks out there. So it's really really interesting stuff, and it's a good time to have a voice in the conversation or just to kind of watch it evolve in real time.
Cool. So this is my contact information. Please feel free to reach out to me. These are also our social media sites. We've got a Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, all that good stuff. So feel free to follow us as well. Lindsay, do we have any questions coming in?
Thank God we do not have any questions.
Ah,
I think we're good. But if you guys come up with any, email ERIKA, or you can go to beyond20.com at the bottom there and submit a contact us, and we will happily help you out.
cool. Lindsay may have mentioned this, and maybe I just hit my head and wasn't listening. But we will send out information so you can claim your PDU. I know that that is on to everyone's top of mind because we're doing this with the Phoenix PMI chapter. We're happy to send that out as well.
You didn't hit your head. I missed it completely. So don't worry about that one thing, at least.
I've got other issues. I've got 99 problems.
Bigger fish. Okay, thanks so much, guys. Let us know if you have any questions, and have a lovely afternoon.